that means uh, this is going to be our last class. We're not going to move our class tomorrow, right? So today is our last class. Get get a jump on summer vacation. I don't know, something like that. It feels warm enough to be summer right now. It's humid enough around here. Um, so today we're just going to wrap everything up and just sort of remind you of some things. So before we get into the book, wrapping up the book, if you have to finish any reading questions or anything that we've done while through distance learning through Zoom, if there are any Google questions that you've yet to answer, make sure you do that, please. You'll have until tomorrow. Tomorrow at midnight, that's the last time that you'll have an opportunity to do that. After that, anything that's submitted after midnight tomorrow, I will not accept. Two, there is no final, right? There's no final thing that we are doing. So once we're done with it today, if you have everything all submitted, you're done. All right, so there's no final. I think those are the only two things. I felt like there should be a third thing just for the sake of having three things. But there isn't, just those two things, all right? If you're having trouble accessing Google Classroom for whatever reason, just email me and I will get back to you as soon as possible to fix any issues that you may be having, okay? So that's the plan for today and for the rest of the trimester, which is just tomorrow. So, like I said, we're gonna wrap up our book today and just sort of wrap up the class as a whole. We did this wrap up of the class for everyone, juniors and seniors, at the beginning of the month. So what we're gonna sort of emphasize as a wrap up, is it too loud? Can you hear all the cars running outside like in the rain? Okay, it's really loud for me. So I just it's loud for you and annoying. So we wrapped a lot of things up for that class, sort of main ideas. I thought it'd be good to sort of wrap up this book with something that the book talks about as a really good way to understand not just African literature, North African literature, but kind of people in general that we sometimes forget. And it's also helpful for us when reading books, when going into books that maybe are not part of a culture that we're very familiar with. To go when we're going into books that are new to us, that we have a perspective on it. There's some stuff in here that I think is helpful to sort of clarify if I can find it again, because I want to make sure I actually have the right quote that I'm pulling from. And if I don't, then I'm kind of foolish because I know I marked it somewhere. But where did I put it? I don't know where it is. But I'll find it in a second once I do. So before we get into that, before we sort of talk about that stuff and wrap everything up, do any of you have any thoughts about any of the books we've read today or read over the trimester, including this one? Any thoughts, anything that sticks out to you, anything that anything that you would take away from reading these stories?
I think just in general that I really enjoyed reading these like stories about North African literature, and it was like really cool like seeing this side apart from like what we like read in like I guess like a traditional school setting in America. And I think something that I would like take away from this class is kind of like exploring more like African literature, and not just like North African but also like West and East, because I didn't take those classes. But yeah, I think overall, I think it was like a really cool class and I really enjoyed it.
I'm glad. I think that's like the main thing. Like, I'm not worried that have a great understanding of like North Africa as a region, and like that's we can't do that here. But I think it's nice to have an opportunity to read books that are not, taught very often or ever in a high school setting. If you take a literature class in college, you may read this book. I didn't read it until I got into grad school. So it's like colleges too, you might not have opportunities. So I'm glad, Summer, that you are took something away from the classes and um, want to explore some different literature. Anybody else have any thoughts?
I liked
I see.
oh
Yeah, August and Jay. Jay, August, you go first because Jay muted herself already.
I was just gonna say, I think they're really great for highlighting how unreliable a narrator can be.
Hmm.
It's really a great thing to take into consideration when you're reading any book, but these books really, like, that's kind of what they were about. So it's
Right.
easy
Yeah.
to.
Yeah. I think that's a good point, and sometimes we forget that when reading literature, especially first-person literature, that we automatically put trust in our narrator, that everything they say is true. And some books really emphasize not trusting a narrator a lot. Some books don't really put that into, like, don't really question that. It's like, why would the narrator lie to you? But you always have to watch out. If it's a first person narration, that the narrator may be presenting a scenario that they think is true, because maybe it is true for them, um, but maybe is not the whole truth. Jay, what were you going to say?
well, I was just gonna say like how it was cool to be able to read both perspectives of like a story,
Mhm.
especially like not just like a random story, like a story about like you know, like I don't know how to explain it, but it's like actual like important story. And yeah, I just thought that was cool
Okay,
that
so
we got to do that.
right, see, having books that are talking to one another, but also
Mhm.
kind of like at least one book is battling another book, and so you get a lot of different perspectives. I always enjoy those types of books too. Um, any other thoughts? That's okay if you don't. Just sort of okay. So um, this book, Seasons of Migration to the North, is definitely can be the most intimidating book, um, because it can feel very strange with our narrator here, who seems to be questioning everything who he is as a person, which we've gotten with the stranger, which we got with Rousseau investigation, um, but really questioning who are they, what kind of person are they? Are they being truthful to themselves, and what does that mean to be truthful to yourself? Um, who are you truthful to? The culture that you grew up in, the place you got your education from, the language you speak, the things that you read. What does it mean to be an authentic person? Is that even possible? Or what do we even mean by being authentic? Um, do people expect you to be a certain thing because you grew up in a certain place or look a certain way? And what happens when you don't abide by those rules or abide by those expectations? Our narrator is really digging into that. And he uses Mustafa's narrative and his story to really question himself. Because you also think about Mustafa, like when we first started talking about this book, we talk about Mustafa being this exploitative man who takes advantage of these English women, one of whom he kills, and we find out, we see him killing this woman at the end, potentially leading to another character's suicide, and just being very sort of leaning into stereotypes about Africa for his own purposes. So he opened up like, should we even trust this guy? Right? Is this a person that's redeemable in any way? Um, but then we get other perspectives about Mustafa, where a lot of people who are, in Sudan, and they look up to him. He's like, this is an African who succeeded. He's done well for himself. He's gotten an education. He has acquired wealth, and he's someone we respect. Whereas in England, he's put on trial. So we have one side that is really praising Mustafa, or another side condemns him. And why did I just close the book? I just closed the book on the exact quote I wanted to point out. And at the end here, we're given this question, or at least Mustafa's perspective, where he's been writing this book. He's died, and our narrator, who's never named, goes into his book, goes into his study, his room that our narrator has a key to, and he's going to show his sons whenever Mustafa's sons are older to look at all the stuff that's in this room. And our narrator goes into this room with the intention of destroying everything. So he goes into this room and he finds a book, a notebook. This is on page 125. And at the beginning of this, there's a dedication in this book. It says, Mustafa writes, "To those who see with one eye, speak with one tongue, and see things as either black or white, either Eastern or Western." So that's who Mustafa is dedicating this book to. It's people who see the world in one way, with one eye instead of two, right? Black or white, Eastern or Western. What we're talking about here is sort of like Mustafa is writing to people who only view the world in one particular way. This book, and the books that we've been reading have been all about giving different perspectives on a situation or different perspectives about the world, and that there is no inherent, like, sort of black and white. It's one thing or the other, and it's always going to be one or two, right? And that's sort of it's why education is important, because we're complicating that. We're making that more difficult, that nothing is easy. Nothing's either this or it's that. And our book ends with this idea that this is not how the world works. We have characters who are complicated. We have characters who grew up, like our narrator here in the Sudan, goes to England, gets an education, has an understanding of a particular culture's literature, English literature, that also celebrates African literature at the same time. It's never just, I only like one thing, that's the only thing that's good, everything else is bad, right? And that's what our narrator's trying to deal with. Who is he? What makes this person tick? And how does he understand himself from all the different things that make him up, that all exist in one person? And that goes back to this idea that we were talking about last class and the class before about hybridity, that when you take one thing or two things or three things, many different things, put them all together into one person or culture, you're making a hybrid, but you're making something new. If you think of food too, all different types of cuisines kind of mix together at times to make something new. All different cultures come together in one place to make something new. So major cities, you think of like New York City, for example, all these different cultures coming together to make a single city. New York City is very much a hybrid city. So it's a city made up of different people, different languages, different religions, but it still works. It still works. And that's what post-colonial novels try to get into. What are all the different little things that come together? What are the complications? What are the issues at hand? But also what's working? What can we celebrate? What's new? And new can be really exciting. New can be really kind of difficult to deal with, but new also pushes things forward. It makes maybe not things better, but just different. So new can be good, new can be bad, but it's new. I think that's also important to recognize too. So our narrator is this new kind of person. Is a new kind of individual who's trying to deal with stuff, but is still also struggling with what they're dealing with. Because the very, very end of the book, he's on the Nile. He's on the Nile River, right? And he just starts floating in the river. And he's just letting his body travel. And he's moving between the North Shore and the South Shore. This could be, I think, a very clear metaphor for the North, like North in Europe, and the southern part of the shore being Africa. And he's going back and forth between the North Shore and the South Shore. And he's swimming and he's swimming, and he decides to float. Float in the middle of the water. Where is it? Say here. So this is on page 138, the second to last page. He's hearing the water, he's part of the water. He says, turning left and right, I found I was halfway between north and south. I was unable to continue, unable to return. I turned over on my back and stayed there motionless, with difficulty moving my arms and legs as much as was needed to keep me afloat. So he's conscious. He says, I was conscious of the river's destructive forces pulling me downwards, of the current pushing me to the southern shore, and a curving angle. I would not be able to keep this thus poised for long. Sooner or later, the river's forces would pull me down into its depths. So the river, north and south, but the river, the movement, it constant movement's pushing him downward. So like this pressure of either being one or the other can be destructive. It can be destructive for someone. But he keeps floating. He keeps floating in the water even though he feels it pushing himself downward. And on page 139, he says, my mind cleared and my relationship to the river was determined. Though floating on the water, I was not part of it. I thought of it that if I died at that moment, I would have died as I was born, without any volition of mine. All my life, I had not chosen, had not decided. Now I am making a decision. I choose life. So our character is like, I'm not going to let the flow of whatever is pushing me along to decide for me anymore. I'm going to decide to do something for myself. And that's an issue that hybridity has. It sometimes can feel forced upon someone. Someone's born into being a hybrid or made it as opposed to choosing to be something. And so our narrator is like, I'm going to choose. I'm not going to be forced into doing anything anymore. And he says, I shall live by force and cunning. I moved my feet and my arms violently and with difficulty until the upper part of my body was above water. And then it ends like with this really weird image, like a comic actor shouting on a stage. So it's like, is it funny? I scream with all my remaining strength, help, help. And that's how it ends. So unlike Mustafa, who we think drowned intentionally, maybe committed suicide but drowned somewhere in the river, our narrator is like getting to that same spot Mustafa has been in. Because Mustafa is also a hybrid. But instead of letting everything weigh him down, our narrator is deciding, no, I'm going to make my own decision and live and choose for myself. I can be both north and south, but I'm going to choose for myself. I'm not going to let anything push me in a certain direction. I'm going to make myself go in a certain direction. And he ends by asking for help, but it's like a kind of comedic way, but it's kind of a very weird ending. But it's a very life-affirming ending that our narrators decide to choose to make a life for his own, that no one's going to force him into doing a particular thing. So that's how the book ends. This book about exploring oneself, trying to understand who a person is, what a culture is, and how cultures can maybe feel stagnant, but are moving really slowly at the same time, moving towards something different. But that culture is like, no one culture is inherently better than another one. There's just different ideas, and those ideas can clash. Sometimes they can clash between the larger cultures together, or they can clash between individuals who represent two different cultures, or clash between individuals that represent all these different cultures and one person that is many different things all at once, and trying to understand where does he live, or where do they live, and how do they understand themselves in the world. But we also, too, to sort of wrap everything up, we've been talking about Hasna, Mustafa's wife, who said that she would murder Wadarayas if she had to marry him. Well, she was forced to marry him, and she lived out her action. She did it. She killed him, and then she was also killed at the same time. She said she would kill herself. So she kills herself, but she also kills the man that was going to marry her. We talk about agency, right? That's a big term, that term agency. And whether or not women in this narrative have agency. And it seems like they do in a very, very powerful, violent way. that men cannot just control these women to make them do what they want them to do. But we have a shift in how women understand themselves in this small world in Sudan, a small village, that she's not going to be forced to do anything that she does not want to do. And she takes action, which our narrator has been struggling with, taking action to do something different, to not be forced into doing something. She makes something for herself, but she also dies at the same time. So we have to think about those repercussions, those consequences. Yes, she has agency, but that agency also leads to her demise at the same time. So what do we do? How do we balance being able to make choices, determining one's own life without losing one's own life at the same time? These are the questions, or some questions that the novel is asking us to think about. And if you ever come across a book where a character is struggling with who they are as a person, over the course of, which a lot of literature is about that. The vast majority of literature is about characters struggling to figure out who they are, because that's the human experience. But a lot of the time it's also, are they gaining control over themselves? Are they determining their own self-interest? A lot of African novels, especially sort of Eastern and Western African novels, are concerned about individuals, but also about the interests of the community. We get the community here in this book, but in this book is like really interested in what the individuals do. But a lot of African literature is dealing with what's the role of the community in the life of the individual, and vice versa. What's the role of the individual in the life of the community? Both of them are really interconnected in a lot of African literature, because communities are really, really important. Keep a community together. That matters. From the books that we've read, we've seen a lot of stuff about individuals and not so much about a community, but how individuals interact with one another make a community. And our narrator here is trying to understand different communities that are kind of not really working well together, but is also trying to figure out, how can I be a better part of my community? Because he's a civil servant. He's trying to make this community better, but it's not really working very well. So there's a lot of stuff happening in this novel, but the main things that I think we should take away, main terms that we should take away, and we're sort of repeating over and over again, with a lot of African literature, this is not just North African, but with a lot of African literature, are hybridity. What does it mean to be a combination of different cultures put together due to colonialism, due to history, right? That you're a product of history, you're a product of cultures coming together. And what new things are you making? Thinking about agency. In what ways do Africans have agency? In what ways have they lacked agency for a long time due to colonialism? Also due to the slave trade. This is not really North African, but also due to the slave trade, or just like how have Africans, or how are they gaining back agency, self-determination, right, to make their own worlds. We also talked about the roles of women in these societies. That's a major issue in a lot of African novels, because a lot of cultures across the continent have a more conservative attitude. That's not inherently a bad thing, but we've seen the rise of a very feminist, powerful female perspective in a lot of African literature, and creating worlds of their own, right? That, again, going back to the self-determination, if countries can get independence, women can get independence too, and that matters in these books. So agency, hybridity, post-colonialism, which sort of is the umbrella term for all these ideas, but also that clash of cultures. A lot of African literature is dealing with those clash of cultures. You can even read like British literature or American literature that have Africans as main narrators dealing with what does it mean to be African and living in America. Not being African American, but I'm from, for example, Nigeria and I live in America. What does that make me? Or I'm from Kenya and I live in Britain. What does that make me? Again, this idea of hybridity. These are the sort of big things that overlap a lot of African literature. They also overlap North African literature too. And dealing with colonialism, dealing with a lot of colonial histories. So those are like the big ideas that leaving the class, I think we can really take away. That if you do read any African literature in the future, think about these terms. Think about how they're working. Are they there? Maybe they're not there, and that's okay. What other things are there? What other important aspects are in the literature that we can take away? What are the big themes that we can take away from any piece of literature that help us understand what this particular author is saying? You can also get these themes from movies. You can get these themes from other sources of entertainment. But I think it's important to be informed readers. And we're developing those skills by finding the larger themes. That's how we become informed readers, to see how these books are connected, but also being able to see what's this book trying to do, or what's this other book trying to do, and what's it trying to say about its world, the world that it comes from, right? Because books are a product of their culture, where they come from. So enough sort of talking at you for the past half hour, but I think those are the big themes that we can take away from what we've read for the trimester. Any final thoughts? Okay, so we'll wrap it up. Just to remind you all, no class tomorrow. So whatever you're going to do at 10 o'clock tomorrow, which was class, you can do whatever you want at 10 o'clock in the morning tomorrow. Fantastic. Also, if you haven't finished any of the work yet, you need to submit some stuff, make sure you do that. Get it in by midnight tomorrow. Okay? Anybody have any questions? All right. If I don't see you anytime soon, I hope you have a wonderful summer, everybody. Have a great vacation. And I hope to see you all in person next school year. That's what I'm crossing my fingers for that, okay? So I'll see you all later, okay? Bye, everybody.